The snow began to fall earlier that year, soft flakes drifting down over the endless plains west of Moscow. By late October 1941, the German army, tired, frostbitten, but still determined, had reached the outer defenses of the Soviet capital. The city's horizon was blackened with smoke and fear. Columns of refugees trudged eastward, carts creaking under the weight of their lives, while the distant rumble of artillery drew ever closer. The Soviet capital, the heart of a nation, trembled. In our real history, the Germans never managed to seize Moscow. But imagine if, through a brutal combination of timing, weather, and decision, they had. Imagine if Hitler had pushed every available resource. If Guderian's tanks had not been delayed southward toward Kiev, if fuel and supplies had arrived on time, and if the Wehrmacht had struck before the Soviet defenses fully solidified. In this alternate October, the German offensive didn't stall. Army Group Center, reinforced by divisions diverted from other fronts, pressed forward with grim efficiency. Guderian's panzers cut north from Tula, while Hoth's armor thrust from the northwest, tightening a steel noose around Moscow. The Red Army, desperate and fragmented, tried to hold its ground, but the reality was merciless. Soviet conscripts, many with little training, some armed with old rifles or none at all, were thrown into the fight like sand against a tide of fire. The Luftwaffe maintained air superiority, hammering supply lines and rail yards. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin refused evacuation. He remained in his office, smoking endlessly, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Around him, staff officers argued in hushed tones about retreating to Kuibyshev, about moving the government east. But Stalin's orders were clear. Moscow would not fall. He did not believe in the possibility of defeat until the thundering of artillery grew close enough to rattle the palace windows. By early November, the Germans breached the outer ring. Soviet defensive lines crumbled under coordinated tank assaults and Stuka bombardments. German infantry poured through the gaps, pushing into the suburbs of Moscow. The snow turned gray with ash and blood. Civilians who had stayed behind found themselves in a waking nightmare. Entire neighborhoods became battlefields. The Red Army's desperate counterattacks bought time, but not salvation. On November 12th, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army broke through near Lyubertsy. The next morning, at dawn, the Reich's black and white flags were raised over the western districts of Moscow. The fall of Moscow was not a single moment. It was a collapse over days. Soviet command fragmented. Some units fought on until they were annihilated. NKVD detachments executed deserters and panicked civilians. The Moscow metro became a refuge for tens of thousands, its tunnels filled with smoke and prayers. Above ground, German tanks rolled through the city's snow-clogged boulevards. The Kremlin itself became the last stronghold. Stalin refused to flee, even as German artillery began shelling Red Square. When the German vanguard finally breached the Kremlin walls, they found chaos and defiance. Soviet guards fought room to room. In this imagined version of history, Stalin died there, either by his own hand or in the crossfire. History would never know. By November 20th, 1941, the city was in German hands. Radio Berlin declared victory. Propaganda broadcasts announced that the Bolshevik Hydra had been slain and that the Soviet Union was finished. Across Europe, bells rang in celebration. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff toasted the fall of Moscow. But the world beyond the headlines was far from settled. The Soviet government, led by Molotov and the surviving generals, regrouped in Kuibyshev. The factories of the Urals still thundered, far from the front. Siberia still held reserves. Stalin's death fractured the Soviet command, but did not completely destroy it. Marshal Zhukov, who had been reassigned to the east, assumed command of what remained. The Soviet Union, wounded but alive, refused to surrender. In the West, however, the psychological shock was enormous. Britain stood isolated. Churchill, in his study at 10 Downing Street, Listen to the BBC report with silent dread. Moscow's fall meant Germany had achieved what Napoleon never could. British analysts feared the Red Army might soon collapse entirely, freeing millions of German troops for an invasion of the Middle East, or even the British Isles. Roosevelt, across the Atlantic, felt the pressure of history tightening. America was still months away from entering the war officially, but the fall of Moscow transformed everything. Hitler, meanwhile, believed he had achieved destiny. In Berlin, parades filled the streets. The Führer declared that Bolshevism was finished and that the eternal German Reich had triumphed in the East. Yet beneath the victory euphoria, German generals knew the truth. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. Tens of thousands lay frozen in shallow graves outside Moscow. Fuel stocks were nearly gone. Rail lines stretched thin across conquered territory. Winter descended with brutal vengeance. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees. German vehicles froze solid. Supply convoys couldn't reach the front. Inside Moscow, occupation troops found themselves facing not cheering liberation, but quiet hatred. The city, though conquered, remained defiant. Underground networks formed among surviving Soviet officers, NKVD agents, and ordinary citizens. Assassinations of German officers began within weeks. The Gestapo responded with executions, public hangings in Red Square, curfews, and mass arrests. In early 1942, Hitler ordered the next phase, to drive toward the Volga and the Caucasus, cutting off the Soviet Union from its oil. The German High Command planned Operation Siegfried, a push east from Moscow toward Gorky and beyond. But without Moscow's logistical capacity, and with the railways shattered, the offensive never reached its full momentum. Soviet industry, relocated to the Urals and Siberia, was now producing tanks faster than ever. American Lend-Lease aid, though delayed, began to arrive through Vladivostok. While Moscow lay in ruins, the Soviet war machine in the east grew like a storm waiting to break. Zhukov reorganized the scattered armies into a defensive belt stretching from the Volga to the Ural foothills. Siberian divisions, hardened by the winter, arrived in endless columns. By the spring of 1942, the Red Army, under new leadership, began to strike back. But the fall of Moscow had reshaped the world in other ways. Japan, emboldened by Germany's apparent victory, accelerated its plans in the Pacific. Believing the Soviet Union was finished, Tokyo shifted its full focus southward, to seize the Dutch East Indies and strike at the United States. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor still came. The world was now fully at war. The United States declared war on both Japan and Germany. Yet in this alternate history, America faced a far more dangerous axis, one that had secured the heart of Russia. Nazi propaganda now claimed Europe and Asia as a unified front against Anglo-American imperialism. German engineers worked to rebuild Moscow into a symbol of conquest. Hitler renamed it Stalindorf in mockery of his fallen enemy. Monuments were torn down and swastikas draped over the Kremlin towers. Still, Moscow refused to die quietly. Underground newspapers circulated, written by hand and smuggled through the sewers. Soviet partisans sabotaged power lines, burned fuel depots, and assassinated collaborators. German soldiers, demoralized and freezing, began to fear the city's darkness. Rumors spread among them that the ghosts of Moscow haunted the ruins, that Stalin's spirit watched from the walls. By the end of 1942, the tide began to shift. The Red Army, now numbering millions, launched a massive counteroffensive from the east. The battlefront stretched over 1,000 miles. German generals begged Hitler to withdraw and consolidate, but he refused. The Führer was obsessed with holding Moscow at all costs. He declared it the jewel of the Reich and refused to consider retreat. As Soviet divisions encircled the city, the frozen ruins became a death trap. What had once been the German triumph turned into a second Stalingrad. Only this time, The name was Moscow. The irony was brutal. Tens of thousands of German troops were cut off inside the city they had conquered a year earlier. The Red Army shelled them day and night. Starvation set in. By March 1943, the last German transmissions from the Kremlin begged for relief that would never come. When Soviet troops finally retook Moscow in April 1943, they found a shattered ghost of their capital. The streets were lined with corpses, the buildings blackened by fire. The Kremlin was half destroyed, its walls scarred by tank shells. In the rubble, they found the remnants of German command bunkers, propaganda posters, and diaries of soldiers who had believed they were invincible. Moscow had fallen twice, but in the end, it rose again. The psychological impact of the recapture was immense. Across the Soviet Union, the people found new strength in their suffering. The Red Army surged westward with unstoppable momentum. By 1944, the Germans were retreating on all fronts. The fall and recapture of Moscow became a legend of resilience, a testament that even when the heart of Russia was torn out, the nation refused to die. For the Allies, this alternate timeline brought a slower but even bloodier end to the war. With Germany temporarily stronger after Moscow's fall, the D-Day invasion was delayed until 1945. The Pacific War dragged longer. The atomic bomb was tested in mid-1945, but the world's focus remained on Europe, where millions more had perished. When the Reich finally collapsed in 1946, Europe lay in ruins deeper than in our history. And as historians of this alternate world would later write, Germany's capture of Moscow changed everything but destiny itself. The Soviet Union still rose again. The Nazis still fell beneath the weight of their own arrogance. The city that burned in snow returned from ashes to become a symbol, not of conquest, but of endurance. The world reeled in the aftermath of Moscow's fall. Across Europe, occupied capitals bowed deeper under German banners. Hitler stood at the height of his power. On maps in the Führer's headquarters, vast red lines marked conquered territory from the Atlantic to the Volga. His generals celebrated with champagne, but their faces were drawn, their eyes hollow. They knew victory in Russia was not as complete as Berlin proclaimed. Behind the front, a sea of resistance still smoldered. The Wehrmacht was bleeding in silence. In Washington, the White House was shrouded in urgency. President Franklin Roosevelt read the latest intelligence reports in disbelief. The Germans now occupied Moscow and controlled the central rail hubs of Western Russia. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had sent a telegram, describing the event as a tragedy for civilization. Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair and whispered to his aides that if Moscow's fall meant the Soviets collapsed, the United States would stand alone against the Axis. The American public, stunned by the twin shocks of Pearl Harbor and the fall of Moscow, finally realized the scale of the conflict. Factories from Detroit to Los Angeles thundered day and night. The arsenal of democracy transformed from a promise into a storm of steel. Convoys began crossing the Atlantic under the threat of U-boats. Liberty ships carried tanks, planes, and food toward Murmansk and Archangel. Ports now isolated behind enemy lines, many never made it. The North Atlantic turned into a graveyard of twisted metal. In the ruins of Moscow, the German occupation took on a grim rhythm. The city was divided into military sectors. Red Square became a parade ground for victory marches, while the Kremlin was turned into the administrative seat of Reichskommissariat Moskowian. Posters proclaimed a new dawn under German rule, but beneath them, faces were gaunt and silent. The Gestapo established prisons in the Lubyanka. Thousands vanished into cellars that once belonged to the NKVD. Executions were routine. German officers boasted that Moscow had been pacified, but every week another convoy went missing, another patrol found mutilated. Deep underground, in the labyrinth of the metro, resistance took form. Former Red Army officers, workers, and students met in secret chambers lit by candlelight. They called themselves the Black Snow. Their weapons were stolen rifles, homemade explosives, and their will to fight. Couriers moved through sewer tunnels carrying messages eastward. By late 1942, coordinated sabotage erupted across the city. Power stations exploded, rail lines were torn apart, and German fuel depots went up in flames. The reprisals were merciless. Entire apartment blocks were burned as punishment. But the resistance did not stop. Moscow, even under occupation, refused to die. Far to the east, in Kuibyshev, the Soviet government rebuilt itself from ashes. Zhukov, now the supreme commander, was ruthless and relentless. His offices were Spartan, maps covering every wall, telephones ringing without pause. He reorganized what remained of the Red Army into 4 massive fronts. Siberian divisions poured in, bringing their own kind of winter vengeance. Trains arrived from factories in the Urals carrying T-34 tanks freshly painted and ready for war. Soviet engineers worked in 12-hour shifts, building aircraft and artillery faster than the Germans could destroy them. Zhukov's message to his officers was simple. "We lost Moscow. We will take it back, or we will die trying." By mid-1942, German intelligence began to intercept reports of massive troop movements east of the Volga. The Wehrmacht command dismissed them at first, sure that the Soviet Union, without its capital, was finished. But in July, the illusion cracked. The Red Army launched its first major counteroffensive near Gorky. Entire German regiments vanished in blizzards of artillery fire. Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed across the steppe, lighting up the night sky. The German line wavered. Inside Moscow, the occupation authorities panicked as rumors spread that Zhukov was advancing. German propaganda ordered civilians to stay calm, but trains filled with wounded soldiers kept arriving. Hospitals overflowed. Supply depots ran empty. The same city that had once been the symbol of Hitler's triumph began to feel cursed. Soldiers muttered that they were living in a graveyard built on snow and bones. Hitler refused to believe in the danger. He ordered more divisions into the meat grinder. He demanded that Moscow be held to the last man. His generals, bound by fear, obeyed. By December 1942, Soviet forces had reached within artillery range of the capital. The German Sixth Army, holding the city's outer perimeter, was encircled. The cold did the rest. Temperatures dropped below 45 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid. Horses died in their harnesses. Men resorted to eating frozen bread, then rats, then nothing at all. When the Red Army finally stormed Moscow in early 1943, the battle was unlike anything the world had seen. Soviet tanks crawled over the ruins, firing point-blank into buildings held by snipers. The Luftwaffe tried to break the siege, but was shredded by Soviet fighters. The smell of smoke and death hung heavy. German soldiers, once conquerors, now fought like trapped animals. By March, it was over. Moscow was free again, but the cost was beyond counting. Zhukov walked through Red Square days after the final battle. He looked at the Kremlin, half collapsed, blackened, but standing. Snow drifted over piles of rubble. Soldiers wept openly as they raised the red banner over the spires. The city was a ruin, yet it felt alive again. The recapture of Moscow electrified the Allied world. Churchill called it the resurrection of hope. Roosevelt sent a personal message to Zhukov, calling the victory a testament to the spirit that tyranny cannot extinguish. In occupied Europe, resistance movements gained new courage. Even in Berlin, whispers spread that the war was turning. The German collapse that followed was slow but inevitable. With so much blood lost in Russia, Hitler's armies could no longer hold every front. In Italy, the Allies landed earlier than in our timeline. In France, underground networks prepared for liberation. By late 1944, Soviet tanks were crossing into Poland again, and the Red Army's banners reached the Vistula. Yet this alternate history carried darker shadows. The destruction of Moscow had left scars that no victory could erase. Entire families vanished in the siege and occupation. Millions were displaced. The Soviet leadership, hardened by loss, grew even more ruthless. The war had become not just about victory, but revenge. When Berlin finally fell in 1946, it was not the jubilant ending of our history. It was a storm of retribution. Soviet soldiers fought street to street, their rage fueled by memories of the burned Kremlin and the massacres of Moscow. When they reached Hitler's bunker, they found only silence and the smell of gasoline. The Reich collapsed not with a shout, but with a shudder. In the years that followed, the world that emerged was colder and more fragile. The United States and the Soviet Union still rose as superpowers, but their scars ran deeper. Moscow's reconstruction took decades. The city became both a monument and a warning, a place where the snow seemed to remember. For the survivors of the Black Snow resistance, life moved on quietly. They returned to the surface after the liberation, blinking in sunlight for the first time in years. Some became heroes, their stories told across the country. Others faded into anonymity, their deeds known only to the shadows of the tunnels they once called home. And somewhere in those ruins, among the broken stones of the Kremlin, a Soviet soldier found a rusted German helmet, its insignia half melted by fire. He lifted it, turned it over in his hands, and whispered to no one. "They thought they could bury us here." Then he threw it into the snow. The wind carried the sound away over the city, a city that had fallen, burned and risen again. Even after the recapture of Moscow, the world remained a place transformed by the city's brief fall. Europe lay in ruins far worse than history had recorded. Cities that had not yet faced direct invasion now bore the scars of prolonged German occupation, and the sheer brutality of the Wehrmacht's Moscow campaign had left a permanent mark on the psychology of nations. Survivors told stories of a city that had endured the cold, fire, and blood, and in those stories, the myth of Moscow's resilience began to eclipse its suffering. Across the Atlantic, America accelerated its war effort. Factories churned endlessly, producing planes, tanks, and ships at a scale that rivaled imagination. Roosevelt, aware that Europe was a far more dangerous theater than anticipated, ordered additional divisions to be trained for an eventual invasion of Western Europe. But he also devoted resources to supporting the Soviet Union, realizing that the Red Army's resurgence was the key to weakening Germany. Lend-Lease aid intensified, with convoys braving U-boat-infested waters to deliver armored vehicles, trucks, and aircraft. Each shipment was a gamble. Many were lost, but the tide of materiel, like an invisible river, began to bolster the Soviet capacity to strike deeper into German-held territory. Meanwhile, in Moscow itself, the city's rebirth was slow and painstaking. Entire neighborhoods had vanished in fire and artillery bombardments. The Kremlin, though structurally intact in part, bore scars from shelling and flames that would never fully fade. The people who returned to the city faced hunger, disease, and the trauma of having lived through occupation. Yet they carried with them a fierce determination. New factories were built in the ruins, workers toiling alongside engineers and planners to rebuild what had been destroyed. Every brick laid, every street cleared, felt like an act of defiance, a message that the city could not be broken permanently. The Soviet government, hardened by the horrors of Moscow's brief fall, adopted a more centralized and authoritarian posture than it might have otherwise. Political rivals were eliminated with a new ruthlessness. The NKVD expanded its reach, monitoring both the population and returning soldiers for signs of weakness or dissent. In one sense, Moscow's fall had forged a government even more determined to maintain control, a leadership that understood the catastrophic consequences of failure. At the same time, the trauma of the occupation created deep bonds among ordinary citizens who had shared the experience of suffering and defiance together. Hitler, emboldened by his temporary victory, had overextended himself. The fall of Moscow had provided him with propaganda victories, but it had also drawn attention and resources from other critical fronts. Japanese strategists, noting the apparent German success in Russia, pushed their plans further into Southeast Asia. They accelerated the conquest of the Dutch East Indies and threatened Australia. Yet even as Axis powers appeared to reach new heights, the cracks in their foundation began to widen. Supply lines were stretched thin across continents. German industry, though immense, was now engaged in an unsustainable effort to hold Moscow while continuing campaigns in the south and west. The Red Army's counteroffensives in 1943 marked a turning point. Siberian divisions, tempered by the bitter winters, pushed relentlessly westward. Soviet artillery, combined with American and British materiel, tore through German positions. Cities like Smolensk, Bryansk, and Leningrad saw renewed fighting, but the Wehrmacht, weakened by winter and overextension, began to collapse. By the spring of 1944, Soviet tanks crossed into Poland, forcing German forces to retreat in disarray. Each mile eastward became a reminder that victory had come at a cost. The streets of Moscow had been held, then lost, and finally reclaimed, and the memory of that sequence fueled both vengeance and resolve. Meanwhile, the atomic age dawned under a shadow of uncertainty. American scientists, aware of the protracted European war, accelerated their efforts at Los Alamos. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this alternate history was delayed by a few months, and the strategic calculus differed. Germany, while weakened, remained a force that had occupied Europe's largest city and demonstrated the capacity to endure. The atomic bomb became a tool not only against Japan, but also a warning to Berlin that no city, however fortified, could escape ultimate destruction. By 1945, the Allies were poised for the final collapse of the Reich. Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia and Berlin itself, while American and British troops advanced from the west. The streets of Berlin were filled with the echoes of Moscow's lessons. Walls and fortresses could be taken, but the human spirit, even when cornered, endured. When Hitler died in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, his empire was finished, but the scars of Moscow's fall remained as a warning and a testament. The post-war world was shaped by the brief occupation of Moscow. Stalin's successors, hardened by the trauma, were unyielding in consolidating the Soviet sphere of influence. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control with a degree of thoroughness and ruthlessness born of survival. In the United States, the sense of urgency cultivated by Moscow's temporary loss reinforced both military readiness and industrial might. Globally, nations understood the fragility of victory and the consequences of complacency in war. Moscow itself became both a symbol and a memory. The city, rebuilt from ashes, carried the traces of its occupation in scars, monuments, and stories. Veterans of the Black Snow Resistance walked the streets, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet pride, knowing they had kept the heart of their nation alive when all seemed lost. Children grew up listening to tales of the winter when the city fell, learning the lesson that resilience could turn even the darkest moment into the seed of rebirth. Even decades later, the impact of Germany's brief control lingered in international strategy. Military theorists studied the campaign endlessly. How overextension could turn victory into vulnerability. How morale and human spirit could dictate outcomes as much as tanks or guns. Moscow's fall, though temporary, became a case study in both catastrophe and recovery. A city that taught the world that even when the heart of a nation is seized, the pulse of resistance continues. The snow over Moscow melted each spring, revealing streets that had been scorched and bloodied, buildings that had been shattered and rebuilt, and a people who had endured unimaginable horrors. Life returned in cycles, as it always had, but memory lingered. Monuments erected after liberation bore names of those who had fought, resisted, and died, both German and Soviet, the living and the dead intertwined in history's cruel balance. The city had been a battlefield, a prize, a grave, and finally, a symbol of rebirth. Its story was one of extremes: the fall and the recovery, the despair and the hope, the cruelty of man, and the resilience of the human spirit. Generations grew up knowing that Moscow had once been conquered, that it had been taken and reclaimed, and that the lessons of its suffering would echo across the world. By the end of the decade, Moscow was no longer just a city. It had become a living history lesson, a cautionary tale, and a testament to endurance. The brief occupation by German forces had changed the course of the war, slowed the liberation of Europe, and intensified suffering, but it had also crystallized a resolve so profound that the Soviet Union, America, and the Allies emerged stronger, more determined and more united than they might have otherwise been. The city's scars were permanent, but so too was its spirit. The ghost of that winter, when Moscow fell, haunted history books, oral stories, and the minds of soldiers and civilians alike. Yet for all the horror, for all the loss, one truth remained unshakable. No city, no army, no tyrant could extinguish the will of people determined to survive, to reclaim their home, and to remember. The snow over Moscow carried memory, resilience, and the unyielding pulse of life itself. The years following Moscow's brief occupation shaped a world that was both familiar and unnervingly different. The Cold War emerged not merely as a struggle for influence, but as a contest scarred by the memory of a city that had once fallen. Soviet leaders, forever haunted by the failure to hold their capital, built a state that was disciplined, highly militarized, and unyielding. Moscow itself became a fortress of remembrance. Barricades rebuilt stronger, museums erected in the ruins, and memorials that chronicled every detail of occupation, resistance, and liberation. The United States, aware that even the greatest powers could falter, maintained a military readiness unprecedented in history. The industrial expansion that began during the war persisted into peacetime, ensuring that America could project power globally. The fear instilled by Germany's fleeting triumph in Moscow became a lesson etched into national memory. Victory could never be assumed, and preparation was a duty. Strategic planning now accounted not only for conventional threats, but for scenarios once thought impossible, like the capture of a capital city by an overwhelming enemy. Across Europe, Germany's temporary success left both a physical and psychological imprint. Cities occupied during the war remembered the brief triumph of Axis forces not as a victory, but as a prelude to devastation. Historians would later write that Moscow's fall, though reversed, demonstrated how overreach, brutality, and mismanagement could turn apparent victories into catastrophic lessons. Generations in Germany grew up hearing of the fatal arrogance that allowed even a partial success to collapse. A cautionary tale woven into national consciousness. In Moscow, life gradually resumed amidst the scars of war. Streets once clogged with rubble became avenues of commerce. Frozen rivers thawed to reveal bridges repaired through painstaking effort. Survivors returned to homes that had been looted, burned, or destroyed. And in every rebuilt corner lay traces of defiance. Graffiti scrawled by partisans, hand-painted signs that read, "We live," and fragments of diaries hidden beneath floorboards. Children were raised hearing stories of the winter when the city fell, learning lessons of courage, endurance, and the price of freedom. The long-term geopolitical consequences were profound. The Soviet Union's westward expansion was more aggressive than in our timeline, fueled by both vengeance and strategic necessity. Satellite states in Eastern Europe were tightly controlled, their populations subjected to strict oversight to prevent any recurrence of sudden occupation or collapse. America and Britain, while allied with the USSR during the war, now viewed Moscow's fall as proof that even powerful allies could be shaken. spurring more intense intelligence sharing, espionage, and military preparedness. The geopolitical map was redrawn not only by borders, but by the collective memory of vulnerability. Technological innovation accelerated as well. The fall of Moscow had disrupted rail lines, communications, and supply chains in ways that forced both sides to adapt rapidly. The Soviets expanded research into armored vehicles, aircraft, and long-range artillery, often inspired by the equipment left behind by the retreating Germans. Americans, meanwhile, pursued atomic and jet technology with renewed urgency, fully aware that an unchecked Axis victory, even temporary, could destabilize the entire globe. The Cold War arms race, in this timeline, began earlier and with greater intensity, a direct consequence of a city that had fallen but refused to be forgotten. The human toll lingered. Families torn apart by occupation struggled to reconnect. Soldiers who had fought in the tunnels, streets, and frozen forests of Moscow carried invisible scars. Many partisans and civilians who had survived found themselves haunted by memories of betrayal, starvation, and blood-soaked streets. Even as the city rebuilt, these experiences shaped generations, forging resilience and a deep cultural identity steeped in survival against impossible odds. By the 1960s, Moscow had fully transformed. Skyscrapers and modern infrastructure rose beside reconstructed historical monuments, a city balancing memory and progress. Museums preserved the diaries, weapons, and photographs from the winter of 1941-1943. Veterans' organizations flourished, recounting not only battles but acts of individual heroism, sacrifices made in the face of overwhelming odds, and the enduring will of a people to reclaim their home. The story of Moscow's fall became central to Soviet education, not only as a narrative of suffering, but as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Globally, historians and strategists reflected on the alternate history with a mixture of awe and horror. They calculated that if Moscow had remained in German hands for longer, the trajectory of World War II and the post-war world could have been dramatically altered. But the ultimate lesson, one echoed in military academies, political strategy, and literature, was this: resilience and determination often outweigh short-term victories, and no occupation, however brutal, can extinguish the core of a nation. The city, scarred and rebuilt, became a living symbol. Tourists, scholars, and veterans alike walked streets once soaked with blood, looking at buildings pocked with remnants of artillery fire. Monuments marked the places where partisans had fought, where soldiers had fallen, and where civilians had endured. Children ran along boulevards once lined with tanks, unaware of the fear those streets had witnessed, yet inheriting the legacy of courage that survival had left behind. The winter when Moscow fell had left the deepest impression. It was not only a lesson in military strategy, but in the human spirit. Soldiers who survived would tell their children, and their children would tell their own, that a city could fall, yet its people could rise again. That even in the darkest of winters, with snow frozen and bloodied, life could endure, rebuild, and prevail. In the end, the fall of Moscow became less a story of defeat than one of triumph through endurance. The German occupation, brief but catastrophic, reshaped the world and hardened the resolve of nations. The city's scars reminded humanity of the cost of hubris, the limits of power, and the boundless strength of ordinary people standing against extraordinary adversity. Moscow stood, not as a conquered city, but as a living monument to survival, resistance, and the eternal rhythm of history. Its story, carried through generations, became a symbol not just of Russia, but of humanity itself. That no matter how dire the circumstances, no matter how absolute the enemy may seem, resilience can turn even the darkest chapter into a prelude to renewal. Snow would fall over the city every winter, covering the scars, but never erasing the memory of what had been endured and survived. And in that enduring memory, the city whispered a truth that would outlast empires, armies, and even the passage of time. Even when a nation falls, its spirit cannot. Moscow had fallen. Moscow had burned. Moscow had been taken. But in the end, it rose again, eternal, unbroken, and defiant. The first snow of winter had barely settled when Mikhail, a young factory worker, found himself crouched in the shadow of a collapsed building, clutching a rifle that was heavier than his arms could bear. He had been conscripted into the Black Snow Resistance weeks earlier, taught only the barest techniques for sabotage and survival. Yet the city's streets were his classroom now. Every corner held the echo of artillery. Every alleyway whispered of betrayal. He remembered the morning the German tanks rolled through his neighborhood, flattening lampposts, breaking shop windows, and leaving behind smoke and fear. His parents had been taken in the early days of occupation, vanished without a trace. Nearby, Anya, a former school teacher, moved silently through the metro tunnels with a bag full of medical supplies. Her hands shook from cold and nerves, but not from fear. She had treated wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Her small candlelight surgeries performed with nothing but determination and a handful of bandages. When Mikhail stumbled into her tunnel one night, wounded from a failed ambush, she looked at him with steady eyes and said, "If Moscow falls, it will not fall with us. We fight because we must survive." That night, she became more than a healer. She became a symbol of endurance, her courage radiating into the freezing corridors beneath the city. In the Kremlin, the German command faced challenges far beyond their expectations. Captain Klaus Reinhardt, a mid-level officer tasked with securing the administrative center, spent days poring over maps and supply lists. He had expected a triumphant occupation, but Moscow's ghosts did not obey orders. Civilians disappeared into basements. Factories were sabotaged from within. Partisan attacks hit the German convoys at every opportunity. Nightly reports arrived of bridges burned and depots destroyed. And each one carried the same grim truth. The city refused to bow. Klaus could not understand why his soldiers trembled more from fear of the city itself than from the Red Army's guns. Far to the east, in Kuibyshev, Zhukov met with other commanders, planning the counteroffensive that would ultimately reclaim the city. Maps were spread across tables, red and blue markers tracing lines of advance. He stared at Moscow's position, frozen in midwinter, and spoke not of vengeance, but of necessity. Every decision carried weight. Lives of soldiers, civilians, and the future of a nation. Even as Stalin's death had fractured Soviet leadership, Zhukov's steely resolve and meticulous planning ensured that the city would not remain in enemy hands for long. Meanwhile, in Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels crafted speeches that celebrated the conquest. Yet behind the closed doors of the Reich Chancellery, generals warned Hitler that the occupation was unsustainable. Food shortages, fuel scarcity, and constant partisan attacks were bleeding the city dry. Hitler refused to listen, obsessed with presenting the victory as eternal. "Moscow is ours," he declared, unaware that the city's spirit had not been captured. The psychological blow of the resistance, the sabotage, and the relentless winter had begun to erode even the Wehrmacht's morale. Back in Moscow, children like little Sasha played amidst the rubble, unaware of the full horror that had unfolded above and below. Yet even in games, they learned lessons of survival: to hide, to move silently, to trust only those who had earned it. The adults around them whispered history in fragments, stories of courage, of family lost, of resistance. Those whispers became a foundation for memory, a secret passed down that would shape the generation who would rebuild Moscow, ensuring that even occupation could not erase identity. The winter stretched on, relentless and bitter. German officers grew gaunt and irritable, while Soviet partisans struck with precision and determination. Each day, the city's survivors adapted, finding food in burned-out markets, navigating collapsed streets, and communicating in code through underground networks. The tunnels beneath Moscow became arteries of resistance, carrying information, medicine, and hope. It was there, in the frozen darkness, that the true spirit of the city endured. When the Soviet counteroffensive finally came, it was not a single battle, but a culmination of countless acts of defiance. Soldiers, civilians, and partisans fought together in streets and alleys, reclaiming block by block. Mikhail and Anya emerged from the metro tunnels alongside soldiers advancing from the east. They had survived, and in surviving, had become part of Moscow's living memory. When the German forces were finally driven out, the city was scarred, but unbroken. In the decades that followed, Moscow rebuilt. But these stories remained etched into the collective consciousness. Streets, buildings, and monuments became markers of endurance. Veterans recounted tales of courage and survival, ensuring that future generations understood the price of freedom. The snow that returned each winter carried whispers of the past, a reminder that even when a city falls, its spirit can endure, waiting for the moment to rise again. Years passed, but the memory of the winter when Moscow fell never faded. The streets that had been battlegrounds slowly came alive again. Shops reopened. Children laughed along boulevards once scorched with fire, and the hum of trains and factories returned. Yet the scars remained, in pock-marked buildings, blackened walls, and in the eyes of those who had endured. Every corner of the city carried a story of loss, resistance, survival, and triumph. Survivors of the occupation, like Mikhail and Anya, grew older but never forgot. Mikhail became a teacher, recounting the stories of courage to students who had never lived through war, insisting that the city's spirit was more powerful than any army. Anya continued her work as a doctor, her hands steady, but her mind always carrying the echo of the wounded she had treated in the freezing tunnels. Together, they embodied the resilience of a city that had been tested to its limits and refused to break. The post-war world reflected Moscow's lesson. Nations rebuilt, but they remembered that even the mightiest forces could falter. The Soviet Union, hardened by occupation, became both a superpower and a nation wary of complacency. The United States, having witnessed the consequences of a temporarily fallen ally, accelerated its global involvement, determined never to allow similar catastrophes. Across the globe, historians debated, strategists analyzed, and ordinary people carried in their hearts the knowledge that a city's fall could ripple through history in ways few could imagine. Monuments rose across Moscow, honoring the fighters, partisans, and civilians who had endured the occupation. In Red Square, plaques bore the names of those who had resisted in the tunnels and streets. In the metro, secret chambers were preserved as memorials, silent reminders of bravery beneath the frozen city. Each snow that fell over Moscow was a veil of memory, covering the scars but never erasing them. Generations grew up learning that Moscow had once been taken, had suffered, and had been reclaimed. They learned that power could seize a city, but it could not conquer its people. They understood that even in moments of despair, courage, solidarity, and hope could endure. The city's story became a lesson not only for Russians, but for humanity. That resilience is stronger than any army, that memory can outlive destruction, and that even when the darkest forces prevail, the spirit of life can rise again. By the end of the century, Moscow had transformed into a city that balanced memory and progress. Modern infrastructure stretched alongside rebuilt historic monuments. Children ran freely across squares once soaked in blood, yet they grew up carrying the echoes of survival and resistance. Veterans, old and stoic, told their stories in whispers, in schools and in memoirs, ensuring that the winter when Moscow fell and rose again would never be forgotten. The snow continued to fall each year, covering streets, parks, and monuments. It drifted over the scars, over the remnants of battles long past, and over the memories of a city that had been conquered and reclaimed. And beneath that snow, in the hearts of every citizen, the truth endured. Moscow had been tested. Moscow had suffered. But Moscow had survived. Its fall had been temporary, its spirit eternal. In the end, the city whispered a lesson to the world. Empires may rise, armies may conquer, and cities may burn. But the human will, when united and steadfast, can endure anything. Moscow had fallen, yes, but it had risen, unbroken, immortal, and defiant. The story of that winter became legend, a testament to courage, resilience, and the unyielding pulse of life that no army, no matter how powerful, could ever extinguish. And so the city stood, proud and eternal, carrying the memory of fire and snow, of occupation and liberation, of death and survival, teaching every generation that no force could crush the spirit of a people determined to rise again. Rise again.